coming out of the gates, let's welcome back Dr. Gerald McDermott.
Thank you, Pastor Dave. A history of Christian Zionism in 20 minutes. Actually, there is a long history, and there is a lot to say. I could go on for hours. You need to know that. It has not just started with the rise of premillennial dispensationalism at the end of at mid and end of 19th century, which is what anti-Zionists would have us believe. Zionism goes back thousands of years, and Christian Zionism goes back to the New Testament church. As Dr. Young showed us last night, Jesus was a Zionist. Jesus was a Jew. Paul, as we'll argue in a number of different talks today, was also a Zionist. It's right there in the New Testament. We haven't seen it because we've been trained not to see it. Now, starting in the early church, remember that one of the fathers who got us off the track was Justin Martyr. Now, I want to emphasize something that Pastor Dave just said, and that is, as a caveat, especially to what I said last night about how a lot of the fathers got us off the track. If Orthodox Christians, both Catholic and Protestant, but especially Protestant, especially evangelicals, if they don't pay attention to the fathers, they're going to lose their orthodoxy. So it's not that we should give them a passing nod. We should sit at their feet and learn about the Jewish Jesus and the Jewish Paul and the Jewish New Testament at the feet of the fathers, even while recognizing the fathers didn't fully get that part of it, but they got much else. And let me just tell you that Protestant liberalism, which is taken over most of the, all of the Protestant mainline churches, became liberal by deliberately dissing the great theological tradition that is made up primarily from the fathers. So the fathers made mistakes. Every theologian makes mistakes. We make mistakes. But woe unto us if we say, well, we're going to figure it all out on our own by reading the Bibles on our own. That's the way to liberal Protestantism. Okay? But Justin Martyr, despite the fact that Justin Martyr was the first of the most important Christian thinkers to say that the church was the true and the new Israel, nevertheless, Justin Martyr said the millennium is going to be centered in Jerusalem. There will be a literal millennium, and it will be centered in Jerusalem. Now, what's millennium? Well, it comes from mille, which means 1,000 in Latin, and annus, which means year in Latin. So 1,000 years, 1,000-year reign that Revelation 20 talks about. One of the most mysterious parts of the Bible, very tiny parts of the Bible, but hundreds of books have been written on things concerning the millennium. Most of the early fathers, until Augustine, believed in a literal millennium on earth. Not all of them said it was going to be precisely 1,000 years. Some said that just means a very long time. But nevertheless, certainly in the 2nd and 3rd century, before the 4th century and before the 5th century, exactly with Augustine, or precisely, or especially with Augustine, most of the fathers believed in that the earth would be renewed in the future, in the eschaton, in the last times, and become a new earth, along with the new heaven. So the new heavens and the new earth. The earth is going to be renewed and restored. And most of them believe the center of the restored earth was going to be Jerusalem and Israel. And there would still be nations. There won't be a one world government, so to speak. It will still be a federal system, so to speak. But the center of the world will be Jerusalem, and Isaiah 2 will come to pass. If you go to Isaiah 2, it says the Gentiles will come to Jerusalem will go up to Jerusalem to learn Torah. And most of the fathers believe that's literally going to take place in the renewed earth. That just as our bodies are going to be renewed, so too the whole physical body of the earth will be renewed. And Justin Martyr, even though he was the first of the replacement theologians, the first supersessionist, nevertheless, even Justin Martyr said there will be a literal millennium with a renewed earth, and the center is going to be Jerusalem. So too Irenaeus. Remember I told you last night about Irenaeus, the first great philosopher of Christian history, or Christian philosopher of history, said the earth is going to be renewed in the future, and Israel is going to have a future in the renewed earth, and Israel is going to be the center of the future renewed earth. Tertullian, another great church father, his dates are 160 to 225. He said, he went even further and said, one day the Jews will return to their land. He said the Bible teaches this clearly. Even in the Middle Ages, even in the, Middle Ages typically are viewed as roughly 500 AD to 1500 AD. Even the 1,000 years of the Middle Ages, even during this period when Augustine's amillennialism was dominant, means not, so there won't be a literal millennium, but the millennium simply means the rule of the universal, of Christ, the present rule of Christ through the present, universal church, which was Catholic, the Catholic Church, until 1054, and then East and West, the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Church in the West, which was Catholic, which simply means universal. Even during the Middle Ages, there was a minority report of Christian Zionists, like Joachim of Fiore, 12th century. And Joachim talked about three different ages in the history of redemption. The age of the Father, which corresponded to the Old Testament period. The age of the Son, which corresponded to the New Testament period. And the age of the Spirit. And he said, someday in the future, in the age of the Spirit, Jews will recognize their Messiah. So he saw a future for the Jews distinct from the rest of the world. The Jews were not collapsed into a Gentile-only church. So a future for the Jews as Jews. And hence, therefore, since the Jews have a future as Jews, God's covenant with the Jews, God's covenant with Israel is not dead. It's not over. Now, Joachim of Fiore is studied by scholars and read by Christians all over the world today. He's not a minor figure. He's among the major thinkers of the Middle Ages. But the real breakthrough for seeing that Israel has a future, not only the people of Israel, but also the land of Israel, was in the 16th century, at the beginning of the Reformation. And it came through the Puritans. It was the Puritans who resurrected the Zionist hope that was there in the church in the first 4 centuries. It was quite prominent in the first 4 centuries, and then sort of went underground until the 16th century. It was the Puritans. Now, the Puritans were Calvinists. Now, Presbyterians are Calvinists. So the Puritans are your cousins if you're a Presbyterian. And what the Puritans did that was so novel and so important was they broke with Calvin's decision to read all the prophecies in the Old Testament about Jews as figures for the church and for Gentile Christians. Calvin said, and I talked about this last night, that everything that's prophesied about the future of Israel, the future of Jews in the Old Testament, is really spiritually about the Gentile church. And the Puritans said, no. No, we don't think that's the right way to read the Old Testament, or the New Testament for that matter. Now, they still were Calvinists, the Puritans, but they didn't follow Calvin in his biblical hermeneutic. Hermeneutic is a fancy word for how to interpret. They didn't follow Calvin in the way that Calvin interpreted the prophecies about the future of the world and the future of the Jews, as all referring to the church. They said, no, they're referring to Jews. It says Jews, and it's referring to Jews. It says Israel, and it means Jewish Israel. And therefore, they said, in the New Testament, when Paul talks about the future of Jews, all Israel will be saved, he's talking about real Israel, Jewish Israel. In some way, they're going to come to the Messiah. And then the Puritans said, the whole world is going to be restored and renewed, just as the rabbis taught. You know, the rabbis in the Mishnaic period taught that when the Messiah comes, the end of the world will come, and the world will be renewed. The world will be restored. So the Puritans said, well, the rabbis are right about that. Now, the Geneva Bible was written in Geneva by exiles from England, because Queen Mary had restored Catholicism, and so the Protestants fled to Geneva, Switzerland, to be with Calvin, and they wrote the Geneva Bible there. And they, in their notes in the Geneva Bible, they talked about the future spiritual return of Jews to the Messiah. And this seemed to prepare the British readers of the Geneva Bible for the idea of a literal return of Jews to the land. Now those seeds were sown in England by the Puritans in the 16th century. And the seeds blossomed. They germinated and blossomed in the 17th century England. Notice the beginnings of Zionism here, long before the rise of dispensationalism, which didn't come for several centuries later. In the 17th century, Puritans went a step further. They said the Jews are going to return to the land without being converted first. That's a further step. Thomas Drax, for instance, said, the Jewish Israel is still God's chosen nation. It didn't change in 33 AD. The chosenness was not transferred to the Gentiles in 33 AD. He said, Christians are debtors to the Jews. And the return of the Jews, now listen to this, to the land of Israel will cause the Turks to try to exterminate them. Thomas Brightman, another Puritan scholar in 1611, said there's nothing more sure in the Bible than that the Jews someday in the future will return to Jerusalem. Now, Henry Finch, a member of Parliament and another Puritan, 1621, he wrote a book in which he argued all the references to Israel in both the Old Testament and the New Testament are about Jews, not Christians. We should not apply them to the church. That's a bad hermeneutic. That's a bad way to interpret the Bible. John Milton, the great poet in Paradise Regained, which was published in 1670, said, I don't have time to read that beautiful passage, but he said, the Jews will return to the land. Sometime in the future, God's going to return the Jews to the land. John Cotton, who was the great Puritan theologian, first in England, and then he came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1620s, he wrote a book called The Mystery of Israel. And he said, Gentiles should help the Jews return to the land. Gentiles should loan or give to Jews chariots and horses and camels to help them get back to the land. Since we are debtors as Gentiles, we owe it to Jews to help them. Increase Mather in 1699 published The Mystery of Israel's Salvation. He said, Israel will repossess its ancient land before converting. And it's wrong to so hyper-spiritualize the promises to the Jews in the Old Testament and to presume they're meant for Christians. That's wrong, he said. So the Puritans, over and over and over again, said Calvin's way of interpreting the Old Testament, transferring all these promises from Israel to the church, is bad hermeneutics. Now we turn to the 18th century. Once again, it's Calvinists from the Puritan tradition. First of all, the Dutch Calvinists. There was a Dutch Calvinist theologian named Brockel, and he published a 4-volume systematic theology in Dutch in 1711, in which he argued vociferously the church is not the new Israel, and Jews will return to the land. Then Jonathan Edwards, the greatest theologian in the history of the Americas. Nobody comes close. It's not just me who says this. I mean, this is a scholarly consensus. No one comes close to Jonathan Edwards as being the paramount American theologian ever, either before or after. Yale University Press, by the way, has just finished publishing the critical edition of the works of Jonathan Edwards. 73 volumes, 400 to 800 pages each. And 27 of those volumes are in hardcover. Jonathan Edwards said, it is wrong to spiritualize the promises to the Jews in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. Jonathan Edwards taught the Jews will return. I just gave a paper in Australia last August called Jonathan Edwards, Christian Zionist. He was. He said the Jews will return to the land. How do we know this? We know this because the prophecies about the Jews are only partly fulfilled. Most of them still live in the diaspora. Now Jonathan Edwards was born in 1703, died in 1758. So basically the first half of the 18th century. He says right now in the 18th century, most of the Jews still live in diaspora. It's clear the prophecies about the future of the Jews have not been fulfilled yet. Now, another reason we know the Jews will return to the land is because it's necessary for God to make them a visible monument of his grace and power. And the result will be that Canaan, the land of Israel, will once again be a spiritual center of the world. And Israel will be a distinct nation, separate from all the other nations of the world. Now, just to give you an example, or a feel, or an illustration of how Zionism was thick in the atmosphere of England at the end of the 18th century. Listen to this. In the 1790s, at Cambridge University, there was an essay contest for students, sponsored by the professors. And students were asked to write an essay, and they said, we'll give a prize to the best essay answering this question: what are the scriptural grounds for expecting the future restoration of the Jews? Cambridge University, the intellectuals in charge of England, were convinced that the Jews would be returned to the land in the 1790s. Now, all of these guys were post-millennialists. That means they believed Jesus would come after the 1,000-year millennium. This was long before the rise of premillennial dispensationalism. These guys were post-millennialists. Now, premillennialists are those who believe that Jesus will come before the millennium starts. And they all believe in something like a literal millennium. So, long before the rise of dispensationalism, which is entirely premillennial, you have all these post-millennialists for centuries who are Zionists, Christian Zionists. Now, the 19th century, the most important Christian Zionist of the 19th century was Lord Shaftesbury. His name more fully, Lord Ashley, 7th Earl of Shaftesbury. Born in 1801, died in 1885. He was the leading proponent of Christian Zionism in the 19th century. His work, because of his influence in the British government, his work laid the groundwork for the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which called for England to establish a national home for the Jewish people. It was the Balfour Declaration, which came out of Shaftesbury's influence, that led directly to the League of Nations giving control over Jordan and Israel to Britain, called the Jewish Mandate, and eventually led to the State of Israel in 1948. So Lord Shaftesbury is the critical hinge figure in England. He's the critical hinge figure in the history of Christian Zionism, and he's the critical hinge figure in the history of the modern Middle East because of what his influence and work led to. Now, Shaftesbury was inspired by three things. First, he was deeply moved by reading Millman's History of Christianity, which showed that the Jews, for almost 2,000 years, have been the victims of Christian persecution. He was stricken by that knowledge, by discovering that. Second, he was moved by a commentary on the Bible written by Thomas Scott in the late 18th century. In the notes of which it was very clear, Scott repeated over and over again in this multi-volume biblical commentary, which went into many, many editions. It was incredibly popular in England amongst Christians. It was 3 or 4 volumes. It was published between 1788 and 1799. And Scott says in that Bible commentary that the Jews will return to the land. And Shaftesbury was convinced by Scott that the Jews will return to the land. And the third thing that moved Shaftesbury was shame over England's persecution of the Jews. He wrote, we English, we were the first Western nation to ban Jews. In 1290, King Edward I, in order to get his nobles to accept a steep new tax, he banned the Jews. And the ban was popular because of the horrible anti-Semitism in England in the Middle Ages. Now, Shaftesbury said, we English, we have a chance to be the first Gentile nation to stop the pattern of treading down Jerusalem. Now, you know that, if you're a student of the Bible, you know that phrase, treading down Jerusalem. Jesus said in Luke 21:24, he said, Jerusalem shall be trodden down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So Jesus said sometime in the future, the time of Gentiles will come to an end. And Jesus and Jerusalem will cease being trodden down by the Gentiles. So Jesus was predicting there and elsewhere a future restoration of Jerusalem and the land of Israel. And he said, on that day, elsewhere he says, Jerusalem will welcome me. Now, back to Shaftesbury. Shaftesbury said, and he wrote this, in fact, ever since England started sheltering Jews under Cromwell first in 1657 and King Charles I, England had prospered. So too Holland. He said, look at Holland, tiny little Holland with enormous power. Why? Because Holland gave shelter to the Jews. He said, look at Spain, once a great empire, but now declining. Why? Well, he said, notice that Spain has been declining ever since Spain in 1492 expelled all Jews. He said, this is obviously a historical manifestation, proof of the truth of Genesis 12:3, where God says to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you, Abraham, the father of the Jewish people, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now I'm going to skip ahead from the 19th century to the 20th century, mid-20th century, to the man who, the theologian who is widely regarded by Catholics and Protestants, and more by evangelical theologians, for better or for worse, as the most influential theologian of the 20th century. And you know what? He was Calvinist, like Presbyterians here. Anyone know his name? Anyone guess who the most influential theologian of the 20th century was on both Catholics and Protestants? Great Calvinist Swiss theologian? Karl Barth. Karl Barth. And I'm sure, since Pastor Dave went to Princeton Theological Seminary, Pastor Dave's head is full of Karl Barth.
Hey, Jerry, you're all welcome to come to my office and see my Barth collection.
Well, there you go. There you go. I have mixed feelings about Barth. But nevertheless, Barth, I have shared this with Barth students, and they've been shocked to hear that Karl Barth, who is anything but a dispensationalist, he rejected dispensationalism. Karl Barth was a Christian Zionist. Now, Pastor Dave, did you know that?
No.
And did they teach you that at Princeton Seminary?
No.
Karl Barth rejected dispensationalism, but Karl Barth never rejected because he was raised in the Reformed tradition. He was emphatic about God's sovereignty over the world and human history. He said, Karl Barth wrote that 1948, the birth of the State of Israel, was a secular parable, a symbol of the resurrection and the kingdom of God. Karl Barth wrote that the return of the Jews to the land in the 20th century, well, the 19th and the 20th especially, is a fulfillment, Karl Barth wrote, of Old Testament prophecies, such as Isaiah 2, when it says the Gentiles will come to Israel to learn Torah. You know, many years ago, not too many years ago, but many years ago, God brought a Gentile named Brad Young to Jerusalem to learn Torah. And look at what's happened now. Brad Young is this major theologian of Jesus and Paul as Jews, whose influence is reaching all over the world, because God brought this Gentile to Jerusalem to learn Torah. And now you are benefiting from that, and you are learning Torah indirectly through Dr. Young, a Gentile brought to Jerusalem. Fulfillment of Isaiah 2. Karl Barth said the Old Testament speaks of a history of Jews that continues down to our own day. Karl Barth said, look at the prophecy of Ezekiel in chapter 37, Ezekiel's dry bones. How many of you know the prophecy of dry bones in Ezekiel 37? Karl Barth said, Ezekiel 37 is primarily about the restoration of Israel to the land. Now, many Jews believe that too. And Karl Barth went on to say, and think back to what Lord Shaftesbury said about Genesis 12:3. Karl Barth went on to say, and I tell Barth scholars this, and they're shocked to hear this. They didn't know this about their master. Karl Barth went on to say that any nation that deliberately opposes Israel will not fare very well in the long run. I fear for our nation, which has started to withdraw support from Israel. If we continue that, there's no doubt we will suffer the judgment of God. I think we're already under judgment. So in summary, Christian Zionism is not a recent thing just since the end of the 19th century. Christian Zionism is not a special reserve for dispensationalists. Christian Zionism is not the invention of Christian dispensationalism. No. Christian Zionism is 2,000 years old. And some of the leading Christian Zionists today are important intellectuals, like the Catholic Old Testament scholar. Now, Dexter's a Catholic. Gary Anderson at Notre Dame is a Christian Zionist. The Lutheran, I was just telling Dexter and Tricia and Brad this morning, and Joanne, that perhaps the greatest living Lutheran theologian on the planet is Robert Jensen, great, great American theologian, enormously influential on Christian theology today, both Catholic and Protestant. And Robert Jensen is a Zionist. He's a Christian Zionist. And this new book that's coming out next month, and I hope you grab a little sheet off there and pre-order your copy. You get 45% off. It's called The New Christian Zionism, and it's called new for 3 reasons. And number 1, has nothing to do with dispensationalism. Number 2, it's willing to criticize the state of Israel. The state of Israel is not perfect. I don't know any other state on the planet that's perfect. Do you? Would you say the nation called the United States is perfect? Or would you say it has some imperfections? And number 3, the third reason why this is the new Christian Zionism, and this is a movement, and I'd say the 4 of us who are speakers these 2 days, we're all what's called new Christian Zionists. We're part of the movement called the new Christian Zionism. The third reason that is called new is because although we might have our own views, privately, officially, in the new Christian Zionism, we are agnostic on eschatology. Agnostic, comes from the Greek. Not, and genoeo, to know. We don't know what all the particulars are about the future, what's going to happen when, where, first, second, third. We prefer to be agnostic. We know the earth's going to be restored, and we know Israel's going to be at the center of it. We know there's a future for Israel and a future for the Jesus people in God's mysterious plan of redemption. But beyond that, we aren't getting into the weeds of prophetic speculation in detail. Amen.